Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the first webinar in CAIR's Director Training Series. My name is Miriam Shurkat. I'm the Chief Risk Officer and Legal Counsel at the Municipal Insurance Association of British Columbia. And I also have the pleasure of serving as the chair of CAIR's new Director Training Committee. For today's session, governing a reciprocal, what you need to know and what you wish you had known, we're extremely privileged to have three very experienced governance gurus to present on this topic. I'll introduce our panelists after a few introductory remarks and some housekeeping tips. The Director Training Committee was created in response to the CAIR membership's expression of interest in training for board members. Our mission is to provide educational opportunities for CAIR members on the topic of governance and director training. At this point, I'd like to take the opportunity to thank the Director Training Committee members. This group has been working hard over the past 11 months to bring ideas and offerings on the issue of governance to CAIR members. It's been a really wonderful, engaged group of people working together on this initiative. We have Craig Pettigrew, our CAIR board liaison from Genesis, Polly Stevens from HEROC, Dave Jackson from CLIA, Zishan Arain from Genesis as well, and Lacey Barnhart, who's also from Genesis. I also want to take this opportunity to thank Emma Roberts from Base Consulting, who's been instrumental in providing all of the background support to make this session possible. I also want to thank Genesis for donating the technology platform for these webinars, and Z Arain for all of his technical savvy. You'll see on this slide a whole host of future training topics. These topics were gathered from responses to the CAIR survey administered earlier this year. And at the end of today's session, we'll conduct a poll to gauge your interest in one of four potential topics to be delivered in the first half of 2021 and the balance later in the year and in 2022. So now for just a few housekeeping tips. It turns out that the most tried and true solution, if you're having technical difficulties, is to simply exit the meeting and rejoin. Sometimes rejoining through a different browser, like Google Chrome, can solve the problem. And finally, you might simply need to call in instead and just use the audio. The telephone number is listed on the invitation. And if you find yourself in desperate need of assistance, please email me. And I will send you the telephone details with the passcode. I am at mshurkat@miabc.org. Rest assured that if all else fails, the session is being recorded and we'll make the materials available to you after the fact if all other forms of connection fail. Please feel free to use the chat box function throughout the session. Remember that all participants can see your questions and comments. So make sure that if there's anything dealing with technical issues, you can just email me. But we will have this session recorded and available after today's meeting ends. A key aim for this and all future director training sessions is to provide members with an opportunity to network. So we want this to be as interactive as our virtual webinar forum will allow. So please do use the chat and the Q&A features to ask questions. You can see on this slide which icons to look for. So with all of those housekeeping matters taken care of, it is my pleasure to introduce today's speakers. We are incredibly lucky to have secured three very experienced panelists for this inaugural session. We have Ann Gergen, the Executive Director of AGRiP, the Association of Governmental Risk Pools, which is a US-based organization and oversees AGRiP's operations, governance, and member service delivery. She has almost 25 years of direct public sector employment and experience in local government management, emergency services, risk management, primary and reinsurance claims, pooled insurance services, and operations. So with her background, it includes reinsurance and commercial industry experience. So she brings a breadth of knowledge to her role. She is nationally recognized in strategic management and operations of public sector pools. She sits on several boards of directors, including the Public Entity Risk Institute and the Upper Midwest Community Policing Institute. She is an attorney, so that's a lawyer for us Canadians, licensed in the state of Minnesota, and she holds a master's degree in public administration. She also teaches risk management to public safety graduate students. So we're very lucky to have Ann with us here today. Next, we have Tom Barnes. Tom has been the CEO of the MIABC since 2005, celebrated his 15-year anniversary this year. In 2012, he became the first international representative to be elected to the board of AGRiP, and in 2016, he was appointed AGRiP's president. Tom also sits on the board of the Canadian Association of Insurance Reciprocals, as many of you know. He is a BC native who was educated at the College of New Caledonia in Prince George, as well as the University of British Columbia, where he obtained a law degree and spent his career practicing as an insurance lawyer before he joined the MIABC. And last but not least, we have Charles Hamilton, who is the chair of the MIABC's board. Charles is the longest standing member of the MIABC's board, despite his young age, having joined in 1994. At that time, he was employed as the city manager of Quesnel. And since then, he's joined the Columbia-Shuswap Regional District, where he holds the position of Chief Administrative Officer. Now board chair for the MIABC, 2018 marked Chair Hamilton's 25th year serving on the board. He is a graduate of the University of British Columbia as well, where he earned a Bachelor of Arts, and he also holds a Master's of Public Administration from Queen's University. So thank you, panelists, and I will now ask Ann to take over.
Terrific. I'm going to just transition to my screen share. The big question of the day will be whether or not I remember to click through the slides. So I've asked Tom and Charles and Miriam to just wave me down and tell me if I get behind on slides. That's sort of a perpetual problem in my world. So as Miriam said, what we're going to do today is walk through an introduction for governing body members or directors of a reciprocal, a risk pool. Governing in a reciprocal environment, in a risk pool environment, is not necessarily intuitive. Certainly, you are a director on a pool because you are a subject matter expert in the operations that are being covered by your reciprocal. So this is your day job. This is what you do day in and day out. You understand the risks that the pool is covering very, very well. There are some elements of running a risk pool, of running a reciprocal, that are just like being on any other board of directors. So there are certainly some commonalities to serving on a nonprofit board or serving on a community board of some sort. But there are some aspects of serving on a reciprocal, on a pool, that are pretty unique and that take some time to learn. So for instance, you've probably already started to learn about those actuarial reports. That is not necessarily an intuitive thing to read through to understand how a loss triangle works and why it matters in terms of your rate setting or in terms of the practices that you have going on in your risk pool. We talk about those actuarial reports and new directors in particular and say, that you can plan probably a good 3 years worth of reviewing those actuarial analyses before you really feel like you settle in and get what those actuarial reports are telling you. But in all honesty, even if you're a longstanding board member like Charles, 10, 15, 20 years in, every time you look at an actuarial analysis, you're going to see something new and learn something new. So even when it becomes familiar, there's still something more to learn. So this is how we're going to spend the next 90 minutes or so. Most of our time today is going to be spent on item numbers 3 and 4. And throughout the day, throughout this time together, we're going to hear from Charles and Tom about their experience. We're going to hear their advice, their perspective, what they have seen and grown into in their roles. So from Charles, of course, we're going to hear some of his experience as a board member. And in particular, I'm going to ask Charles to share what he wishes he had appreciated earlier on in his tenure on the MIABC board. So when he looks back and he reflects over all that time, what are things that he wishes he could have picked up on sooner? That is a great piece of advice and insight for everyone on the call today, I think. And from Tom, who's worked with a number of directors over the years, this is a good opportunity for him to share some of the experience of what they've been through, some of his relationship experience with them, and some of the good things that those different kinds of directors have brought to the pool and to the table in his governance structure. So we're going to talk through these things. We're going to focus on governing in general. We're going to try to take some opportunities today to comment on pandemic specific considerations as well. We don't want to spend all our time sort of mired and struggling through the pandemic, because goodness knows we're all living that enough day in and day out. But we will, where there's opportunity, raise some pandemic specific considerations. Now, I warned you in the chat as Miriam was doing the introduction that we were going to ask you to chime in via chat in a few places. And just to kind of get us warmed up and get us started, let me ask now, for those of you who are pool directors, sit on the governing body, would you just put into the chat how long you've been in that role as a governing body member, so that Charles and Tom and I can kind of get a sense of what your experience level is. It'll give us a chance to kind of practice with that chat and to see those answers roll in. While you're putting that in the chat, thank you, Tanya. While you're putting that in the chat, let me also just tell you that if you have a question, please feel free to put it directly in the chat. You can also use the Q&A button that exists in the bottom Zoom toolbar as well. So if you have something that you don't want to interrupt, during the flow of the conversation today, go ahead and put that in Q&A. Put it in the chat. We'll do our best to try and monitor chat as we go. But in this webinar style presentation, it's a little hard because we can't see all of you. So that chat is really going to be our opportunity to connect with you. So we've got some pretty good experience. Some of you are relatively new. I see 2 years, 4 years. 1.5 years, Rob, thank you. Others have been on the board of directors for a while, 7 years, 10 years, 12 years. So that's really great. It's good that we have that variety of perspective. I would, again, Jason Schneider saying brand new, so that's great. I would again just encourage you all to use the chat as much as you can. If you see something that we're talking about or hear something that we're talking about and your experience as a 12-year veteran is different and you want to share that perspective to help Jason as he settles into his new role on the governing body, please feel free to use that chat and do that throughout the presentation today. So I'm going to point you to 2 reference materials just as we get started here. After today, you will have access to this PowerPoint presentation. It'll be shared with you via email. Also through email, we're going to send you these 2 items that are listed here as well. Now, these 2 things, the textbook that's listed, the question to ask your pool, these are both also accessible on our AGRiP website. I've listed the AGRiP address here on the screen. It's entirely open. Anybody can go get that. Also in this terrific multimedia world that we get to operate in right now, I know that there was a link posted as well to the questions to ask document right in the Zoom chat. And I would actually encourage you to go ahead and link to that document during the presentation, download it to your computer. You can open it up. There'll be a couple of different times when you might want to reference to it. That question to ask document that we linked in the chat, it is unique to public entity pooling. So it's written with the perspective of AGRiP, which is the perspective of public entity risk pools. But even though the intro is sort of talking about public entity risks, the questions themselves are all industry neutral. So it's a really good cheat sheet, especially for those of you. I mean, I love that we've got a variety of experience among the board members who are on this call. For those of you who are brand new, right? You've been on the board of directors for less than 2 years. Take a look at that question to ask sheet and just keep it in the back of your head as you go through your governing body meetings over the next year or 2. And it will help you sort of tee up some really great questions that you can be thinking about and asking to make sure that you learn. And for those of you who have been on the board for 10, 12, 15 years, you have great experience, and you can probably go through that questions to ask sheet and sort of check things off to say, yeah, I know this. But maybe over the course of that 10, 12, 15 years, you know what your pool is doing, but you have forgotten why it's doing it that way, right? So that questions to ask cheat sheet again might be a great way to just refresh your own familiarity with the board that you sit on. So there's lots of whys on that questions to ask document. And that's a really important consideration as we go through all of this material today and as you govern in your reciprocal setting going forward. Pools do many, many things differently from one another, and that is perfectly okay. In fact, it's to be expected. It's one of the great things about pools is that there's sort of this great example of local control, making decisions that make sense for your members and doing things in a way that makes sense for your operations. So when we talk about pooling and pool governance and pool decisions and structures, really the focus is not so much on what you are doing specifically, but rather why you do it. And as a governing body member, that's one thing I would encourage you to really, hone in on and think about is why are we doing something this particular way? Why does it matter that we do it this way? So that's the questions to ask document. The other document that's referenced here is a textbook-like document. Again, it is public sector focused. So we're talking about public entity risk pools like MIABC or Genesis, and it's US focused, but it has generally applicable concepts. So I don't think you would find it difficult at all to look at that textbook and sort of read beyond the references to states instead of provinces, or read beyond the public sector focus and see lots of concepts and information that are going to be useful to you. So that's the orientation. We're not going to give you a history lesson in pooling today, but I do want to pause here and just give you a bit of perspective into the start of pooling. For public entities in particular, pooling started in the mid-1970s when the commercial insurance industry essentially walked away and stopped providing coverage to public entities because the kinds of things that we were doing as public entities were just too risky to be covered by a commercial insurance policy. And so if you have any question, yes, this slide, this is a real magazine cover circa 1986 when public entities, cities, counties, schools, towns, all across the US could not insure their risks. And there was a real crisis as a result. Those public entities were truly uninsurable. And it's not unique to public entities. So we know the construction industry in particular has suffered some similar fate when it comes to commercial insurance, that construction is seen as this inherently risky business profile, that some commercial insurers from time to time have stepped away from construction. Health organization liability, same story. Homeowners and rental insurance for condos, that whole sort of common area, and then the condo rental insurance is probably today's version of this same story about the commercial insurance market taking a step back due to high loss ratios, due to reinsurance issues, due to a lack of capacity in the marketplace. So regardless of the industry that your pool is covering or the geography that your pool is covering, you probably have a component of this exact same historical context within your pool to share. And so Charles, this is a place where I want to pause and ask you to chime in here, because I know that you feel strongly, right? You believe that this historical perspective is really important for governing bodies to have and to keep in mind as they're governing the pool and making decisions. And so I want to hear from you about why this historical context is really important for the governing body to understand and to keep sharing with your pool members.
Thanks, Ann. Oh, there we go. Good morning, everyone. I see there's a number of my colleagues from MIABC on the webinar this morning, so a big shout out to all of you. Good to see you there, as well as a big warm welcome to those representatives from the various other pools. On point there. Oh, and actually one thing, can I just amplify one thing, and we'll probably get into it later, Anne, and that goes back to your previous slide on reference materials. And for those newer directors, that textbook document, the Introduction to Public Entity Risk Pooling, is a phenomenal document, and I certainly wish I had access to that when I started too many years ago. So, but on point, and I think really the historical context is important because it really brings back it deals at the heart of the question is, what are we doing and why? As you mentioned, the insurance pooling is the product of the crisis. You mentioned the mid 70s. I thought it was a little bit more of the early to mid 80s. But in any event, public entities were finding it extremely difficult to provide or to obtain liability insurance. It was difficult to obtain, and it was the coverage wasn't that broad, and the prices were very expensive. So I think you need to understand that sort of overarching philosophy that proved as the sort of the impetus for the start of the pooling movement in a big way. And really that's, the powers in sort of collective risk sharing and being able to provide to public entities, broad insurance coverage on predictable terms and stable prices. So I think that's always got to be sort of front in mind, or at least back in mind, because it's had a phenomenal influence shaping what we do as organizations.
And Charles, in what you're seeing within your membership too, do you see that there is maybe a little bit of a historical loss or a memory loss in terms of maybe new members coming into the pool or people within the membership changing over who don't necessarily understand or know this history?
Yes and no. Yes, in that we've had a fair degree of turnover because we have somewhat of a unique board. We have a hybrid board that is made up of both elected officials who are subject to the election cycle, and we have appointed officials that typically have more longevity, let's say, in their positions. But I've known many that have been terminated, so we get turnover in those ranks as well. The historical aspect of it is important, but what I've noticed is the caliber of the directors, and this goes back to the discussion we'll have a little bit later on the real move in the late 90s in the aftermath of the Enron and WorldCom scandals, and governance became front of mind. It became the qualifications required for directors and the screening process and the regulatory intervention approving these new directors. So the caliber of new directors on my board now versus 15, 20 years ago is phenomenally higher. And you've got some very bright and talented people there, and from all walks of life. But I go back to your very first point. None of this stuff is intuitive. You're absolutely right on point, because there is a steep learning curve. It takes a while, to feel comfortable with it. So while history is important, I think I like to spend less time looking in the rearview mirror and looking towards the future, because I think that's where the opportunities are going to unfold.
For sure. Thank you. And that's a really great perspective or insight. I struggle with this too. And I spend a lot of time sort of saying, let's not get stuck in history. It drives me a little batty when, we've got folks who've been around this industry for a long time, and we just keep telling the same historical story over and over. I'm not a huge fan of that, except that there is a really important lesson in that history that we have to find a way to say and a way to educate not just our governing body members, but all of our pool members. And that important lesson is that we're here for a stability factor that is very real. Pools don't step out of the market because the risks are too great or the claims are too bad. We don't step into the market because it appears profitable and we think that we can play market share or play the risk to our advantage. We're here for a really different purpose, and we operate in a really different way, right? We operate as an extension of our members, not just a vendor. So there's never this us and them mentality in pooling. There's just we, right? We're doing something together. The pool and the members together are approaching risk in a way to assure that stability. And so we have to find a way to keep telling this historical context over and over because it is still real today. We see it coming out in wildfire risks. We see it with earthquake risks. In the US in particular, the West Coast, the sexual abuse and molestation claims are having an enormous impact on public sector commercial insurance right now. Law enforcement risk, communicable disease exclusions. We see example of where that commercial industry relevance may come into question again. And there's a really important role there for pools, all really important reminders about the value of pools. So although no one at a cocktail party is ever going to understand it when you explain that you sit on this pool board of directors, it actually is not all that unique, and it's not necessarily intuitive, but there are elements of it that aren't entirely unique. I just want to give you that perspective of the universe that you're in. So this map shows you the geographic distribution of AGRiP members in the US, Canada, and Australia. Some places like California and Washington, we have many pools. There's 100 pools in California alone. Many, but not all of the pools in the US are state specific. And we have a handful that are multi-state and a few that are national in scope. Now, certainly you have your fellow CAIR members as well. And this map doesn't illustrate the distribution, the geographic distribution of CAIR coverage the same way as I have it mapped in the US through AGRiP, but you get the same point, right? You've got this cohort of pools doing things very similarly for similar purpose. Here's just another quick view of those AGRiP member pools to give you that perspective. This time, this view is by line of coverage that those risk pools offer. So you know that as you consider options for, how do I value my members' property? How do I make sure that we get the right property on the schedule? How frequently should the pool be doing that? If you are thinking about those kinds of questions for your pool's property program, you have 160 or so other pools that you can look to and ask for advice on that question. So the total number of pools in this chart are more than 215 because many of our pools in the US are multi-line. Some of your pools are multi-line as well. Some of these lines you can be very thankful that you may not offer. So there's another reason why we share this map to start. To put what we're all doing as pools into perspective. So here's your pool. You are the blue dot in the center of this slide, and you offer property coverage or liability coverage, and you're offering that property or liability coverage for universities, for lawyers, for airports, for municipalities, right? So you've got this purpose, this very direct purpose. And your pool is governed by people, all of you, who are experts in those underlying things. You are experts in universities, in airports, etc. And you, of course, are in your province, and there might be another reciprocal or two. So maybe those two blue dots in the center there are Genesis and Munich's, right? They have a similar membership structure. They're in the same province. But there also might be other pools in that Alberta province as well, writing other kinds of coverage, maybe not for municipalities, but the red, the yellow, the green dots are still those other reciprocals there in the province. And regardless of membership, regardless of the underlying risks, those reciprocals have some provincial regulations in common, or maybe they have a lack of regulation in common. They have common needs like actuarial analysis or reinsurance support or financial audits that have to happen each year. So even within that different membership that each of those reciprocals serve, presenting different risks, there is commonality between these pools. And then of course, it's not just Alberta or any other province. CAIR represents reciprocals in 6 provinces. And beyond CAIR, beyond Canada, there are still other pools. So remember back when you were just that blue dot of a pool, right, sitting there in the center, and you share something in common with all the other blue pools in your same province, and with all the other blue pools, frankly, in Canada and in the US. And that commonality among the similar pools, maybe it's property pools, for instance, might be important for some things, like your regulation or your lack of regulation. But when it comes to what's happening in the reinsurance market, right? When it comes to what are other pools who are writing property coverage seeing from their reinsurers in terms of pricing, in terms of terms, and the reinsurance treaties that they're being offered, all of these blue dots across the entire pooling universe are who you want to hear from, because those are the pools who are offering the same coverage as you, who are buying from the same reinsurers, shopping that same market. And you want to know what their experience is, what kind of pricing and terms they're getting. So it's important that, you know, for some questions, you're really looking pretty narrowly at the other pools in your province. For other questions, you're going to want to look to CAIR. And for other questions still, you're going to want to look even more widely at the universe of pooling. Or maybe you're the pool that's represented by the red dot in the center, and maybe you're writing liability coverage for healthcare facilities, and there just aren't a lot of other pools like you, reciprocals like you, even in Canada. And you need to understand, if you're that liability coverage provider for healthcare facilities, you need to know what's happening with new COVID-19 protocols and policies. How are communicable diseases being handled, both within the facilities and also within the reinsurance market? Your best point of comparison, if you're that red dot, is going to be with other similar pools, no matter where they're located, those other pools that are working on those same risk management issues as you. Or maybe your biggest challenge right now in your pool is that your members are being cherry-picked by a competitor. So you've got really stiff competition. You're trying to do what you need to do in order to hold on to your membership. So maybe it doesn't matter so much, you know, where you're located or what kind of members you have, or even who that competitor is in your market right now. You could be any of the highlighted dots on this screen. What matters to you is, how do you keep your members connected to the pool? And you need to hear ideas from others about marketing campaigns that they've used or about online tools that they've introduced. You want to know what their underwriting techniques are in order to offer some sort of contribution offset, or what other strategies they've used in order to maintain their market share. So the thing about this pooling universe is that no matter what your current need or issue is, there is another organization out there who is experiencing the exact same circumstance. Or frankly, even better, there is another organization out there who faced the same thing like 2 years ago, and they can give you the playbook for how they addressed it and how it went successfully, and they overcame whatever issue or struggle or challenging they were facing. And that's, Tom, the first opportunity to bring you into this conversation. Miriam noted in your intro that you have been a very active participant within both CAIR and AGRiP. I know you feel strongly about building connection between pools. And moreover, I know that you and MIABC have stolen lots of good ideas from other pools. So I wondered if you would share a little bit about that perspective.
Okay, sure. Thanks, Ann. I think it goes back to when you and Charles were talking about how relevant the history of why pools started is to operating pools today. And I like to look at that question from the other direction, which isn't learning why pools started. To me, we're into our 4th decade of pooling. The question is, why have pools survived for 40 years when they were created in answer to a temporary problem in the mid-80s? And there's a lot of answers to that, which we don't have time to go into, but the thing for directors of pools is they largely are not insurance specialists. They usually, their subject matter expertise comes in the subject matter that is being insured. And now they're being thrown in where they have to make strategic decisions about an insurer or an insurance program, not about the business that they do from day to day. And so there's always Charles talked about that learning curve. And the best place to learn is from other people and who have encountered the same thing and done the same business or overcome the same challenges. I just go back to when I first got this job, and I took over what was a successful organization, but there was an expectation when I was hired that I would somehow improve the organization. Nobody hires a CEO just to keep things the same. And I was in a very early meeting with our board. I rhetorically said to them, I don't understand why we can't be the best pool there is in Canada. And the board, they all looked at me and went, well, what are you talking about? Of course we are. And I thought, well, how do we know that? We don't, how many other pools are there? What do they do? And as soon as you start finding other pools, you find pools that are actually achieving things that are better, doing things better than you are, or you might be doing things better than them. And it just leads to that collaboration. The nature, we're fundamentally collaborating when we form a pool. And we see how successful that is. Why wouldn't we collaborate with other pools to be even more successful? It just seems logical.
Awesome. So the key message being that there's pretty great potential within this network of pools, and there's a very practical reality to that. Tom, to your point, it's not just a nice, like, let's be a community kind of mindset. As directors, as governing body members, you all already know your members and their business. That's your area of expertise. Understanding these dots is how you build upon that knowledge within pooling and gather the information that's going to allow you to really govern your pool effectively. Now, one final illustration related to this graphic. There are, of course, other external influences. So the biggest other external influence is your industry itself, right? Whether it's municipalities or electric utilities or egg hatching or whatever it is, you have to consider what's going on in that industry, because that is absolutely impacting your pool operation, your risk profile, and what you need to do going forward. Again, you already probably know this better than anyone. You're already an expert, and that's what makes your input on this board so incredibly valuable. You have to bring forward that expertise and that knowledge. The other element, though, is to appreciate the commercial insurance markets, because those insurance markets will also influence your operations and your pool activities. And even though the commercial insurance market is different than what you're doing in your pool, it impacts you. So as a director, this is an area where you'll have to build your capacity and your understanding of larger insurance trends and influences, because they are going to impact your reciprocal, its coverage, its pricing, and its operations. So Charles, again, I wonder if this might be a good opportunity for you, coming from that board member, governing body, director position, to share some perspective about what you had to learn about the commercial insurance market in order to really serve your pool effectively. Where was that learning curve for you?
Well, it's an interesting interface between the public entity with which you're involved and the commercial insurance. And as you quite rightly point out, they're not one and the same. There are some fundamental differences, member owned, member driven, as opposed to, sort of a profit motive insurance company, commercial insurance entity. But there's a number of activities going on in the insurance marketplace generally that influence that influence what we do. And for example, let me illustrate. Just things like we can't be tone deaf to hard or soft markets, availability of excess or reinsurance, the strength of the economy generally, that also fits into it because it's going to affect your investment return. But I guess the biggest difference is we don't have that profit motive, but I would call it a member satisfaction motive, and where you want to retain your members and convince them that they're getting best value for the assessment that we levy. So I'm not sure whether I was on point there on the question, but that's certainly, everyone is, you're quite right, an expert of their own public entities. Local governments, we're well, apart from the property, we're primarily a local government organization, and we don't have any pools in Canada that offer workers' comp. I mean, that's all legislated provincially. So that's not something that, pooling's involved in here in Canada. So, but with that, I don't know if you wanted to follow up, and hopefully I got the gist of your question.
I think you did. Hey, Charles, let me ask you this one really specific question. Do you remember maybe one of your first board meetings hearing a term where you walked away and thought, I have no idea what we were just talking about? Was it hard market, or was it, some actuarial analysis? What was it that you walked away and thought, I just am clueless. I have to go look this up.
IBNR.
Awesome. That's a good answer. Incurred but not reported. So if you're a new director, you can save yourself a lot of heartburn right now. Go Google IBNR, read the Wikipedia definition, and then the first time it comes up for you in a board meeting, you'll already be ahead of the curve. How about that? Fair enough. Fair enough. Okay. So let's talk specifically now about your role as a governing body member or a director of your pool. So when is knowing IBNR going to come into play for you? When do you need to know that? So the focus of a governing body in any pool, right? Really the focus of the pool itself, regardless of your industry, is to accomplish these three things. Number one, you're going to enable the underlying members to do what they do, right? Your goal is just clear the path, take risk out of the equation, worry about it so your members don't have to, and they can do the business that is their business. That's your number one goal. Your number two goal probably is to find the lowest long-term cost, which is really important because that does not mean that you are going to provide the members with the lowest cost in any given year. So how do you provide the lowest long-term cost? You do that through tailoring your coverage. You do it through tailoring your pricing. You do it through tailoring your service because, again, you are industry experts. You know this industry better than anyone else. So you can write the coverage and you can set the prices that are going to be stable and predictable and low over a long period of time, not subject to the market fluctuations that the commercial insurance industry would bring to the table for your members. This is also this lowest long-term cost proposition, right, is also the product of us not having a profit incentive. So the money that we as pools are collecting and managing ultimately still is the members' money. And so we have that sort of stewardship mentality that means we're going to keep the cost as low as reasonably we can. And then the third focus always is to change the cost curve. I know now we use the term flatten the curve differently, but this is really what we're talking about here, right? We know as pools that the only way to change the ultimate expense that we are going to see and that our members are going to see is for the member to avoid the claim in the first place. And so it's our role as a governing body to do that, to help members avoid the claims and to really change their trajectory for the future. So when we say, and I think Charles said this, right? When we say pools are governed by or for members, that is really about us operating as an extension of our members. It's not about your structure so much as it is about your mindset, how you approach your role as a director, that you see yourself as an extension of the members. Now that said, even when your decisions seem high level, even when your decisions are appropriately structured or laddered to let your pool manager manage and you stay at the high level, that governance level, that still means that every decision you're making has a very direct and real impact on your pool's operations. The decisions you're making are going to impact how claims are paid, how underwriting is conducted, how risk management is done. You have real and meaningful decisions that you have to make as a governing body. So here's that framework that we said we would offer up today, a framework for thinking about your role or your mode of governance on your pool's board of directors. So these are modes of decision making, and every question you face, every decision you make on your pool's governing body, you'll be operating in one of these three different modes of decision making. You'll be making a fiduciary decision, which means you're really building the foundation and assuring the security of the pool. Or you'll be making a strategic decision. So you'll be setting goals and determining the direction of the pool. Or maybe you'll be making a generative decision. So you'll be exploring some new and creative possibilities. Now, I just offered those sort of 1, 2, 3. They're presented on the slide, sort of 1, 2, 3, which makes it feel like maybe they're sequential. They're really not. All governing bodies are going to execute at all 3 levels all of the time. And in any given decision that is before you as a pool board, one of you might be operating with a fiduciary mindset, another one of you might be operating with strategic. You might be making a decision that is part and parcel of all these things. Sometimes the newest person, so I think Jason, it was you who was brand new to the governing body, you might actually find it easiest coming into that governing body to function at the strategic or generative level, right? Because you don't have that historical context or the anchors of the financial audits or the ORSA requirements or whatever it is. So you're not automatically going to operate with that fiduciary mindset, but you do have a lot of questions and you've got a lot of experience having been a member of the pool to ask those strategic questions or to ask those generative questions. More often, probably newer board members, because they want to be cautious about what they're offering. They want to be mindful about what they're offering. They tend to maybe execute at the fiduciary level as a starting point. So it can be a little bit more comfortable maybe to think about sort of how are we doing and to mind the store at that fiduciary level. So we're going to talk about how each of these modes of operating look in practice. Fiduciary, this is the one that you probably are most familiar with. You know, you're already mindful of your fiduciary role. This is the role that we describe as sort of minding the store, right? You want to make sure that the pool is doing what it is supposed to be doing, how it is supposed to be doing it. You're looking at it as a company, as an organization. You are heavily compliance focused when you are operating in your role as a fiduciary on your board of directors. So things like, what's your net position policy? What kind of personnel policies does your pool have? What kind of travel policy do you have? Is there a conflict of interest for the board of directors, for the governing body? Is there a conflict of interest policy in case you as a member have a claim against the pool? What does that look like? Are there settlement authorities that are clearly articulated in policy and that everybody understands? You know, what kind of regular reporting do you get? So anything in your board packet that is a standardized report that you get, you know, board meeting after board meeting, that is a fiduciary document probably, right? We're talking about your claims paid reports, your settlement reports, the kinds of claims that you've paid out, your financial reports, you know, if you get monthly financial reporting, if you get year-to-date budget reports, if you get a copy of the financial audit, that's a fiduciary document that helps you fulfill this obligation. If you're getting a copy of your regulatory or your compliance filings, if you're getting a report out that, you know, your annual performance evaluations have been conducted, whatever that looks like, that you can say, yep, we're doing things the right way. We're checking the boxes. We're making sure that the pool is operating as it should. Now, in all of the cases where you're executing on these fiduciary roles, on these fiduciary obligations, it's important to remember that the board is operating really responsibly to the membership as a whole. And so that's your obligation, right? Is that you're doing the right thing by the whole of the membership. And that can be a little tricky depending on your governance structure, right? So in particular, if your pool operates with one member or one governing body member per pool member, right? So every pool member has a seat on the board. The fact that that governance structure isn't automatically representative can make it a little trickier to make sure that you're really always asking the question about what's good for the pool as a whole, not just what is good for my organization as a member. Remembering that you're the steward or the caretaker of those pool resources. So to me, here's the key element of this fiduciary role and the fiduciary obligation. The board, each and every governing body member, each director, should be knowledgeable enough to exert some degree of independent decision-making. And that's a tricky balance, right? Because it does not mean that the board is going to know everything that goes into the day-to-day operation of the pool. That is not your role. But you should know enough to ask good questions. And when we look at pools that have audited unsuccessfully, that have been found to be out of compliance with regulations, that have been challenged legislatively, or frankly challenged by their members for not doing things the way that the members want them done, what we see in every example that I can think of is that the board was found to be not exerting independent decision-making authority. They were found to be just rubber stamping decisions without any demonstrable independent knowledge. So not second guessing, not getting too deep into the operations, but asking good questions to demonstrate that you really care and know enough to ask those questions along the way. And that takes a fair amount of work. It takes a fair amount of work to ask those questions, to know what to ask, and also to hold back from getting too far into the operational weeds. And so you really have to make sure that the board and the manager, the pool director, have good collaboration and cooperation in order to find this balance effectively. Tom is commenting, if you see it in the chat, that meeting that fiduciary obligation and reading claims reports can be frustrating at times. Absolutely, for sure, that you need to look at that, and sometimes you'll scratch your head over some of the claims that you see rolling in the door, no question about it. So part of our goal today is to give you some of those fiduciary questions to ask. This is the document that was provided to you in a link when we first started. You have it on the website. You'll get it again in email. This is the questions to ask. This is kind of a cheat sheet, frankly, for you to fulfill your fiduciary role as a director. Now, there are 70 questions on that list of questions to ask. You are not going to ask them all at once, please. Nobody on your staff wants you to do that. Some of the questions might not be directly relevant in your pool, right? So there may be some compliance elements or some regulatory elements that you have to ask differently. The questions to ask list does not mean you should go back and be able to answer or check all those boxes tomorrow. It just means that over the course of the next 2 years, 4 years, you are listening for these kinds of questions, and you're considering your own familiarity when it comes to all of these different elements of your pool operations. This fiduciary role, it is big and it is juicy. So on this slide, I've selected just about 10 questions or so from the list, just to give you a flavor for when you go look at that whole list of the kinds of things that you might expect. So these questions range from, what's your reinsurance structure, to what's your pricing philosophy, to how do you measure your member satisfaction, and oh, by the way, what are your pool's contingency plans for pool data if there were to be some sort of data loss or data breach. So I'll call your attention, just as an example, to the fourth bullet on this slide. At what level is the pool retaining risk, and why is that the right amount of risk to retain? The second part of that question is the magic, right? Why is that the right amount of risk for you to retain? You're going to see lots of questions like this on the list. Again, there's a lot of variation in how pools have decided to conduct their business. That is perfectly okay. We are not one size fits all. There is very little in this business that is right or wrong. The important thing is that you know why you do things the way you do them. So a lot to know to be as effective as you can as a director. You can't cut short the fiduciary roles, and I assure you 70 questions is not too many to know the answer to. So of the three roles, this fiduciary role is probably your most important, not in every decision, but across the whole, you have to be able to meet this fiduciary obligation. It's your legal obligation. It is the fulfillment that you make to your members, that you are going to protect the pool's whole membership. You certainly don't want to get stuck only in this role, but you for sure want to make sure that you meet the expectations of it. So Charles, again, I'm going to turn to you on this and ask you to comment on your experience on the MIABC governing body. What for you is most important about your fiduciary decision-making as a director?
Thanks, Ann. You mentioned at the outset that of these three modes of governance, that they're not necessarily sequential. However, I would argue that there is a hierarchy, and you seem to kind of suggest that at the end of your comments there. And it's, it's like sort of, Maslow's self-actualization hierarchy. And really, if you don't, if you're not checking all the boxes on the fiduciary mode of governance, it's pretty hard to deal effectively with strategic and generative aspects, because I think a lot of those strategic and generative aspects are going to depend on how well your line of business is functioning. So that gets into your minimum capital test is going to give you opportunities at the strategic level to look at a broader range of options, providing ensuring that you're complying with all legal and regulatory requirements. And certainly the financial reports and audits are very important for all the directors. So I agree with you in part, but I firmly believe, and maybe this is part, maybe I'm old school, and this was ingrained in me. And again, I was involved in the board during those, the corporate governance crisis, and then the way in which, various government organizations responded to that to basically provide, greater public and consumer confidence in the way in which these organizations are run, and to safeguard people and pension funds, investments and whatnot. So that's certainly my experience. And again, maybe, and frankly, before we had our little chat last week, I had to go and look up these three modes of decision making. Back in, when I started out, Carver was the model, and that was the be all and end all. And frankly, I haven't kept up on all the sort of academic literature on, best practices surrounding governance, even though I think under Tom's leadership, he's done a very effective job at getting us to think, outside the box into these more strategic and generative and opportunity-based decisions. But I'll flaunt my bias here. I'm definitely, sort of grounded in the, what I see as the foundational mode, which is the fiduciary. And I like to think I have some imagination to deal with some of those higher level ones. So back to you.
Yeah. And that's fair. Let's not get hung up on the methodology or the mode or the model, right? I don't care about the framework. It's kind of one of those things that when you see it, right? So when you're operating on the board of directors, when you're fulfilling a fiduciary obligation versus when you're doing something strategic, even if you don't put the framework to it at the time. You appreciate it probably in the moment or upon reflection. So is your question to fiduciary obligation the same as your earlier answer about IBNR? Like what was the biggest hurdle to meet your fiduciary obligation on the board when you started?
Really understanding just the complexity of the business generally. And you got to remember, I was probably on the board for 10 years before any of the directors were afforded any meaningful educational opportunity. And so, 10 years on the board, and then this was the chair at the time created a governance committee because the public lens was on that. And this is where Tom got us involved in AGRiP. And I remember going to the pooling basics course down in Savannah, Georgia. And listening to that, I can't remember his name, but he's from Montana. He's a real sharp guy. And I sat through that, and I knew quite a bit, but at the same time, there was so much I didn't know. And keep in mind, I was on the board for 10 years at this time.
Right.
So, I think just the, getting comfort, and what I've always, tried to impart to directors over the years is, hey, don't expect to know everything. This stuff is complex. You've got very talented staff there. Your role is largely oversight, and hopefully you bring some creativity, to this particular, to your role on the board. But I think, just sort of getting thrown in there, and you can tell the process of getting nominated and approved, even to have your name stand, those requirements through provincial regulation have gone up, considerably over the years. In fact, to the point, I don't think I would have qualified when I was first put on that board. And then over the years, we had a series of directors that, got on the board through the FOG test. So anyhow, it's, I think that was it. And the educational aspect, I think it would have been much more helpful and meaningful. And I'm certainly happy that we can provide those opportunities to new directors.
Yeah. So Tom, from your perspective, you've seen directors transition, and you've seen different styles, different people on your board of directors. What makes for a good director when it comes to executing on this fiduciary decision making?
I think it's as simple as understanding what their role is and what the role of management is. When we first started down this road, it was over 10 years ago on the MIABC board, I retained a governance consultant to come in and work with the board and to work with me. And the way I put it to the consultant at that time was we had probably three different general concepts of what the board's governance role was on the board at that time, which didn't make it an easy board to deal with. And what we talked about was, what I need you to do as the board is to build a corral around me as the CEO, so that there's a fence, and everything that happens inside that fence is my responsibility. And what happens on the outside of the fence is your responsibility. So when we're clear about that, because fences do two things, right? They keep things in and they keep things out. And that's, when you're operating that way, it requires the respect for both parties to understand their role, which means as the CEO, when there are strategic or generative types of discussions that we need to have, we let the board have it. We have those discussions at the board level. We regularly update our strategic plan at a board retreat. All of our staff are very familiar with our strategic plan, and we make a point when we're dealing with the board, going back to the board with suggestions and pointing out how they relate to the strategic plan that the board has set. So it's, once you get those roles figured out, it gives you some talking, a basis to do the talking and the basis to proceed.
Yeah, awesome. And we're going to share an example, one illustration of a strategic plan that comes from MIABC in just, I think, about a slide or two. Paul asked a question in the chat that I think is just, it's a great one to just pause for a minute and talk about, because it's a great illustration of an important, a couple of important concepts. One being the fiduciary role, two being the fact that every pool sort of has to figure things out for themselves to a certain degree. So Paul's question is, how do you balance the fiduciary responsibility with this member-owned concept and bad actors? Meaning, I guess, members in your pool who might have really high claims and who might be jeopardizing the financial wherewithal of the whole, right? And so what it's such a great fiduciary question, because you really are balancing what's in the pool's best interest, right? We need to protect the assets of the pool. We need to protect the net position. We don't want a bad actor disrupting that financial stability for the whole of the membership. But then the other side of that equation is, again, we're here to protect our members, to enable our members. We have to recognize that any member can have a bad year. Any member can have a couple of bad years. Any member can find itself with decision-making that maybe creates some claims. And we're here to support those members in making the decisions they need to make. So this question of a bad actor is one that pools have to struggle with. I mean, if you haven't had this happen in your pool yet, I can pretty much guarantee you will at some point. And the answer to your question, Paul, unfortunately, is not, hey, execute your fiduciary role by doing X. The answer to your question is you execute on your fiduciary role when you talk as a governing body about where you want that line to be and what you want the response to be when you have a member who's got some bad things happening, maybe is acting in some inappropriate ways, and you have to make some discretionary decisions about how to treat them and how to manage them as part of your operation, or if you want to manage them out of your pool is the consideration. So, I mean, I think the answer is you'll execute appropriately on your fiduciary obligation as long as you're having the conversation and making a conscious decision about what to do in that circumstance. Now, I can tell you from pools who have had that exact circumstance, right, where they've had a pool member who really has been maybe acting inappropriately, creating some high claims. What do pools do? Well, normally they come up with sort of a hierarchy of penalties, if you will, and they work in sequential fashion with their members to first try risk management, first try education, first try awareness and conversation, and then move up the spectrum to maybe some probationary standards, right? That you're on probation with the pool, and here are some risk management obligations or some decision-making obligations that you have to meet if you want to continue to participate. And then moving along to maybe some pricing models that would help incentivize better behavior by that member. That's not the only solution. Some pools will move more quickly to the pricing solution because that makes sense in their world. No right or wrong, but the conversation of, how are we going to manage those members who maybe aren't having the claims experience we wish they would, that's a great example of your fiduciary obligation as a board member. So let's move on and talk about the strategic role. So when you're operating at the strategic level, you're asking the question, not just how are we doing, but where are we going? Where are we as a pool heading and what's our strategic vision? So this is setting the direction of the pool. This might look like a strategic plan. It might look like you setting mission, vision, values. It might look like you doing a strategic planning meeting with your board of directors. It might just mean setting annual goals, so that you sit down once a year as the board and just ask, what are we hoping to accomplish with our pool this year? Maybe it means that you are developing a specific plan for a specific set of goals or a specific set of needs. So you're doing succession planning for your pool's top executive. You are developing a new probationary program for bad acting members, and you want to kind of articulate that program. You are creating steps because you want your pool to reach a certain net position, and you want to have a really, targeted way to get to that net position. So you're really making a plan on how to do that. So we're not talking about your strategic role as necessarily a strategic plan document or a thing, but rather about the strategic vision being clear and being articulated in whatever manner or whatever fashion that means for your pool. And it also means making sure that the plan has some metrics and some meaningful, real steps that you can get to. So maybe it's a question of, making sure the board understands, hey, we've got this strategic goal. Who owns it? Who's actually going to execute on this goal? What's our role as a board to get this goal accomplished versus what are we expecting our staff to do? Who are the stakeholders? You know, if we reach this goal, who's going to benefit from it? Or who do we need to talk to make sure that we're working in the right direction? How is our pool getting the message out? So we've set this goal, that's great. Our staff is responsible for, you know, communications, but what is it that we need to make sure that we're talking about as a governing body so that the message really gets heard among the membership? So the key thing about being effective in your strategic role is that as a director, you have to actively collaborate, or you have to actively participate in order to execute on this strategic role. It's really hard to execute on this role if you're sitting in on the sidelines. So finding a way to be participatory, to be active, and to be engaged is really, really key to executing on that strategic planning, strategic role. So no, I didn't have a question. I thought I was going to have a question for the chat. So when you're talking about strategic role, one example of this that I wanted to share is the example from Tom and Charles at MIABC. Now, the danger in sharing this example is that it's a fairly unique one. So MIABC does this visual illustration of its strategic plan, which is pretty cool, but it's not something that every pool is likely to do. So Tom, maybe it would be useful to have you talk about this illustration a little bit in terms of why having the strategic plan is so useful, whether it's a visual plan like this or something else that a pool might do.
Well, sure. I mean, our first strategic plan was actually in a booklet form. It was very pretty and sat on people's shelves, and I don't know that anybody read it after we published it. Then we moved to this illustrative way of documenting our strategic plans, and it has been very effective for us. It's very simple to go and see what we're doing and what we want to do. There are copies of this made for every board member and every staff member. So if you walk around our office, you will see almost everybody in their workstation has this somewhere where they could read it and look at it. And then the staff that have been around for a while kind of take a point of pride of actually we usually do this every 3 years, and so they will have 2 or 3 of them on the wall of their workspace to show that they've been committed around or been around here for that period of time. And when you look at it, you can see that there's combinations of fiduciary, strategic, and generative thinking that goes into these, and it just is something that's easy for us to focus on and to follow and to mark our progress.
Hey, Tom, will you talk a little bit more about how, almost maybe you don't use it daily, but how on a regular basis you come back to this strategic vision? And I know in particular, maybe in the pandemic, right, you relied on your strategic vision, the strategic plan, in order to guide some of your pandemic response, right?
Yeah, that's absolutely true. I mean, we were like everybody else. We didn't practice for the pandemic. We didn't practice working remotely, but we all had to do it. And our members, generally, when they have a problem at all, of almost any nature, they will call us for advice, because that's what we do. We were, of course, overwhelmed, not just with requests for practical advice and legal advice and scientific and medical advice from our members, but local governments all over BC were, even those that weren't our members, were scrabbling for that information. And one of the things we did, and it's right here in our strategic plan, is do we open up our resources for non-members? And you look at our plan, and one of the things that the board had set for us was to identify and pursue new opportunities to serve all governments in BC. And that's what we did. We started having webinars and think tanks, sometimes 2 or 3 times a week. And we went from having 2 or 3 dozen people attending our webinars to hundreds of people. And not just from our members, but from province, from local governments across, in Alberta, Saskatchewan, and even, because what we were pulling together, these medical experts and these legal experts that were able to reach that wide audience with very practical information for them. And that had nothing to do with risk management in the sense of preventing claims. It had everything to do with being the go-to service provider for practical information that we've become for our members.
So what I love in particular about that story is just that you had this odd circumstance, right? You didn't prepare, or you didn't plan for and practice. You said, I didn't practice the pandemic. So you had this unique need, this unique point in time, this thing that you were thinking about doing, a delivery, a set of tools, some delivery beyond your membership, right? Hey, we've got this and we think we should be doing this. Let's test it against the strategic plan that we have. Let's make sure it fits. And you used that strategic plan, in this case, the visual, as the litmus test to say, is this something we really should be doing? And that is a great example of the perfect value of thinking strategically and having the board fulfill this strategic role. Because then as staff, when you've got this idea, this question, you don't have to bring every minutia management decision back to the board. You've got the strategic vision already in hand. You can test it to see if it fits. So that, I think, is just a great pandemic specific example of how valuable that is.
It was like as simple as, should we open up our website to non-members? And we looked there, we went, well, that's in keeping with our strategic plan. So that's what we did. Not forever, but.
Awesome. So Charles, what about from your perspective as a board member? What do you see as the most important consideration when it comes to fulfilling the strategic role? And you said, your home and your first thought is fiduciary obligations. So when you think about this strategic role, what do you think is most important?
Well, let me just use that foundational metaphor once again, and that is, once you've checked off the boxes or you're comfortable at the fiduciary level, it creates an array of opportunities that allows you to look at and assess, strategic directions. So one of the themes that that has been consistent on, there's been a sort of a bias on the board. We've been quite conservative over the years, but building members' equity certainly has been a recurring theme and a strong motivating factor of the board. Well, those are fiduciary responsibilities, but what it did is it opened the door for a number of strategic decisions, and that had to do with such as increasing our retention levels and over the years, because when we first started, we were retaining a layer of $250,000, and because we had so little capital. So by making those sort of base decisions, it allowed us to be more creative, to take more risks, but without being reckless. So, that's the way I see it. So maybe I disagree with you a little bit that, to a certain extent, I do see them as sequential. The other thing, I'm going to do a shout out for your organization, Ann, and that is one of the most impressive documents, and it was one of your conference themes a couple of years ago, but it was entitled Making Your Pool Future Ready, Thriving in Uncertainty. And I think that really touched upon a number of key points to consider. We're all dealing with this uncertainty. Every meeting we're confronted with some measure or some degree of uncertainty. And I don't know if that's on your website, but I would encourage the viewers to at least have a cursory look at that, because it sets out a fairly nice little framework for things to consider at the strategic level and readying yourself for the future. Thanks.
So Charles, is that a mindset that you use? I mean, how do you just personally, do you have a way that you prepare to come into a strategic conversation, or a way that you remind yourself to, think about an issue strategically instead of from a fiduciary standpoint?
Well, I think, again, maybe flaunting my conservatism a bit. I think we're, I'm very much, driven or aligned with the core themes of our organization.
Yeah.
And I think those core themes or principles, are foundational to thinking strategically. And things like the stable pricing, predictability, and those key principles. But really, it's the strategic planning process is very high level. It sets those themes, and then to operationalize it, Tom presents the board with an annual work plan, which, to the greatest extent possible, aligns those strategic themes with concrete work plans and objectives.
Yeah. So a couple of things here. First of all, for the folks who are listening, actually, this is a test to see if there are folks still listening. So how about for those of you who are board members, right, regardless of your experience, in the last few months, you've been going through this pandemic, right? You've been sitting on an altogether new board of directors, really, because the decisions you've had, the questions before you, the issues that your pool is dealing with are very, very novel. So if you would, just take a minute while I finish this other thought and put into the chat how the pandemic has impacted your pool strategic vision, like where you see the pandemic having some kind of connection or disconnection to what your historical strategic outlook and strategic vision has been. Let's just get a sense for where folks are feeling that pandemic impact. And as you're doing that, what Charles just said connects to the question that I see has come in that Tom, another Tom, not Tom Barnes, has asked about whether pools should use their strategic plan overview in every board meeting package. So the question is, should we put the strategic plan in every board meeting package, not the full plan, but maybe just highlights to remind our board members of what would follow? Or would that be overkill? And to the question of what should we do, I think the answer is, what works for you to do. And why I love how that connected to what Charles just did is, Charles, I heard from you some really key words that it's very, very clear that your pool and your board has just internalized, right? You said, I'm always thinking about stability. I'm always thinking about predictability of coverage and of price. And I'm sure those words, stability and predictability, are written into some strategic plan. I'm sure they're written into your vision that you use, the mission that you share with members. Like, those words have become institutionalized. And so to the question of, how do we keep strategic vision in front of the board, do it however your board is going to hear it and know it and be able to respond the way that Charles just did. If that's a shortened version of the strategic plan, by all means. If that's a couple of key words that are, printed on your letterhead or printed on every board agenda, put those key words on there as that visual reminder. There are some pools that tie every agenda item back to a component of their strategic vision. I am not necessarily advocating for that because it's a very hard structure to maintain, but maybe for you in your pool, that structure really makes a lot of sense and you need that constant tie back to the strategic plan for whatever reason. So, whatever mechanism works for you to make sure that your board members, your governing body, can do exactly what Charles just did and be able to articulate out those key strategic concepts that keep you functioning the way you do, more power to you. So I'm not seeing anything in the chat. So either we lost them all or there, now we got somebody. Thank you, Rob. So you're keeping your eyes on claims, right? Making sure that your claims types aren't changing in the middle of the pandemic, which is really important for your strategic vision, because if your claims on the whole are heading a different direction or are looking fundamentally different, it could be cause for asking some questions about your strategy from a pool perspective. So that's a really great input there. Okay. I'm mindful of time as well. So we've got one more role to hit on. So let's do that. Let's talk about the generative role. We've covered the solid foundation, and Charles, where Charles wants to start and be sequential, and that is awesome, perfectly okay. That fiduciary role. We've talked about the vision, the strategic role, and both of those things, the fiduciary and the strategic role, are crucial to being able to execute on this generative role, because this is where the governing body begins to add even higher value to pool decisions, not just react to questions that are posed to the governing body or to specific options that are raised in strategic planning. So the kinds of words that I would use to describe the generative role: you're thinking outside of the box, you're imagining the possibilities, you're finding creative solutions, you are forward thinking. You're thinking in terms of why don't we try this at the pool level, right? Why don't we try or experiment with our members with this? I'm from the Midwest. I live in Minnesota. You might have already picked up on the accent. I like to call the generative thought process the how about, right? The how about exercise. How about we try, writing parametric coverage? How about we try engaging with members in a new sort of advisory group format, right? It's just that how about, what if we kinds of considerations and ideation. So as a director, remember what we said at the beginning, you understand the pool's goals and operations well enough to formulate your own unique ideas about what the pool could be doing or how it might benefit from certain changes. That's not to say you're always going to get it right. That's not to say that your ideas are always going to be implemented, but in just posing those ideas, in posing those questions or the how abouts, you are being additive in the conversation, and you are very uniquely positioned in your role as a director on the pool's governing body to do this. You're an expert in the underlying risks. You've built baseline fiduciary and strategic insights, but you are not an operational expert in pooling, which is to say you are not limited by the constraints of what you know has to be done in a certain way or using a certain technique. You are perfectly positioned to be thinking about all of those ideas that those of us who might be dealing in the day-to-day can sometimes overlook. So where you bring these characteristics or these areas of expertise to the table, that is when you really have the opportunity to fulfill on your generative role. So what does this look like? It can look like making sure your board agendas have enough time to just think openly about topics, right? That it's not all just handing out reports and reviewing reports. It can look like simply sending a message to your pool director about a new idea you have or about a question you have that might generate a new idea. A great example of this at a pool in Minnesota, they had a really horrible claim. Somebody who said they didn't like to look at the claim reports, a really horrible claim with a kid who fell off the bleachers and had a traumatic brain injury. And one of the board members at that pool in Minnesota said, why don't we write a coverage that would retrofit bleachers and that would stop kids from falling off bleachers? And they wrote a specialty coverage that was a retrofit bleacher coverage to put, backstops on the bleachers to stop a kid from falling off. It wasn't a big deal to write, wasn't a hard policy to write, didn't cost them a lot of money. Great member service. And it came from a pool member, or excuse me, a governing body member who just offered up a how about, right? So this looks like those ideas, that sharing, just openly forwarding your ideas along. So Tom, let's get your input here. What is it that a governing body member needs to do or know in order to be effective in their generative role?
I guess the first thing is you can't think outside the box unless you have a good idea what the box is. Going back a little earlier, Charles talked about IBNR. And my time in this job, the two most common questions I get from directors are, what's IBNR again? And how much capital do we need? And capital is called different things. It's kind of the generic term. Some of you might talk about it as subscribers equity or your net position. Some even call it surplus, which I don't like because that indicates it's something you really don't need. And the answer to the capital question is, what do you need it for? Because if you tell me as a board member what it is you want to use the capital for, then I can, as a CEO, go out and tell you how much we need to do that. An actuary will always tell you that if you have capital, you have options. As a director, you should automatically think, well, what does that mean? What options does an actuary think about when they say we as an organization will have options if we have enough capital? And what do those options look like? And already your box is our minimum MCT that we need to keep our license is 150%. And but how much more than that do you need? And why do you need more? And what is that going to enable you to do? And so I'll just give you an example of that leading to a generative discussion at the board level at our third quarterly meeting in September of this year. Is we were really concerned as the pandemic went through the summer about whether our members were going to be able to collect their tax revenue that they needed. A lot of their other revenue sources had been suspended, and we were worried about whether or not they would be able to have the cash flow to maintain even their core obligations in 2021. And we were setting our pricing for 2021. And so we had a long discussion with our board about different options in terms of payment or installment payment, even discussing whether we could come up with a way of financing members' assessments and their premiums. And it was a very fruitful discussion, and we got some really good practical analysis from people associated with our members as to how urgent they really expect these problems to be. And we ultimately went a different route from some of those more out of the box type of options. But we didn't have the ability to even consider those options without having a good solid capital base. So I think that addresses the things that you asked me to, and it tells you, and maybe it would be an illustration to Charles of being involved in a generative discussion in a board meeting, even though we didn't actually label it as such.
Yeah, Charles, you want to bring in last word on this topic, and we'll wrap it up. Like you've said, this is not your comfort spot. It's not where you start. So how do you come into these generative conversations to make sure that you're bringing that what if or that option mentality to the table?
Very carefully. I subscribe to the theory that chairing a meeting is more art than science, and curiously, in my day job, I play the same role advising an elected body, and so it's a little bit. I really have to kind of approach these board meetings through a different lens. But I understand that. But you got to remember, you've got 15 individuals on this board, and it's not a homogeneous bunch. They bring a lot of different skill sets to the table. But there's a vast array of interest and interest points and areas of expertise. So you got to read the reactions and the body language of the individuals, because we can have have some great discussion that has perhaps some academic value, but in terms of getting the business of the board through the board, is off message. So I try to bring this sort of pragmatic approach to the board. I don't want to paint a picture of myself that I have no imagination whatsoever, but at the same time, I think to run a meeting efficiently, you want to be mindful of these disparate viewpoints around the table. And frankly, I can just look at someone and I can tell if they're lost. We're in the day and the age of things. I'm sure everyone attending this thing has sat through meetings and received texts from one of their staff or colleagues in the room, like snoozer, And, I don't think that's productive. So I think you want to kind of read the audience and you want to tailor it. So, the key business gets through, but as Tom said, provide that opportunity for that more expansive, forward-looking stuff. So that's how I would characterize it, Ann.
Yeah, I think what's awesome about that and the way that you've shared that is that this generative component doesn't happen without invitation, right? It does have to be intentional, probably, to be effective. So somebody, the board chair is a great somebody, has to say, hey, Taylor, what do you think about this? Hey, Joe, what do you think about this, right? Somebody has to be invitational to get this conversation started. And so it's clear that you all are sort of living that practice within your own pool governing body. So just quickly and wrap up, I mean, we've talked about these 3 different roles, the fiduciary role, the strategic role, the generative role, offered some great examples along the way. We know that it's a learning curve for all board members. It's a learning curve to know about IBNR and actuarial reports and be able to fulfill that fiduciary role. It's easier maybe in some ways to ask some out-of-the-box questions, some strategic and generative questions if you're not anchored by some of that historical perspective. But you actually have to wade in and ask those questions, and that can be really tricky for a newer board member in particular. So the encouragement along every one of these roles is just to go ahead and ask the questions. That is the most important way that you can fulfill at any level, right? Is to just ask the questions when you have them, whether that's sending an email to your pool director or asking in a board member or in a board meeting. Just getting the question out is half the battle. The need to know information more specifically, coming out of today, make sure that as a board member, you have the ability to exert some level of independent thinking, that you're asking the questions, demonstrating that you are not just rubber stamping management decisions. That's an important element of executing on that fiduciary obligation. Looking back to that question to ask document and just every now and again pulling it out and making sure that you know what those questions are and you know how your pool has answered them. And then the expertise that Tom and Charles have shared today, just about their own personal experience and asking those questions and sharing those details and thinking about things differently. So that cheat sheet, again, is your green light to ask, the single most important element of fulfilling your duties as a director at every single one of those levels. Tom or Charles, any final closing thoughts? Or Miriam, I think we're done. We're probably over on time.
No, that's fantastic. We are over time, but I think that's fine in this virtual world. If people need to hop on another meeting, it's just one click away. So there was one great comment that I just wanted to make sure we got in here. Catherine from HEROC made the following comment, and I thought this might be a good way to wrap things up and leave us with sort of future focused plans for this. Is that the comment and the question that she posed was that in HEROC's experience, people forget why we needed pooled programs to begin with. And so you could see decreased interest, but in a time of crisis, everyone remembers. Do you think it's important to keep the knowledge base high so that we don't lose ground in the good times?
That's an easy one, yes. Right, Tom, Charles, would you say yes?
Yes.
Yes.
Perfect. Well, great. Well, I want to first off thank our panelists. This was a fantastic discussion. For my part, I've been the governance adjunct to our board for almost 7 years, and I learned a lot today, and so I found this a really great opportunity. I love the networking that we were able to do. So Tom, Charles, Ann, thank you so much for your time. We will be launching a poll right now to see what future director training topics you'd most like to see in the first half and second half of 2021. And so if we can ask those in attendance today to vote, that would be great. And again, thank you to our panelists.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.